I am the current president of the South Asian Society. It is my pleasure to welcome all of our panelists here, as well as our moderator, Professor Fair. Thank you guys all for coming, and I cannot express my gratitude enough to the Security Studies program, as well as to our panelists. I'm excited to see this program occur, and I'm very excited to see what all of our panelists have to say about debt trap diplomacy in South Asia.
Hi, I'm Christine Fair. I'm a professor in the Security Studies program, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. Is Ambassador Haqqani, has he joined us yet? Nakash, has Ambassador Haqqani joined us?
Ambassador Haqqani is having some difficulties in logging into the Zoom,
okay.
So we hope that he will be with us very soon.
Okay, not a problem. So I actually thought that, so I presume that everyone has access to the speaker bios, but I thought that I would begin this conversation by asking Professor Devarajan to make some presentation. I know he has a view which is important because it is contrary to a lot of the conversations that we hear on this topic. So I'm going to ask each speaker to present for about 15 minutes, leaving us time to field questions and answers. So, Professor Devarajan, the stage is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. And in particular, let me congratulate my fellow Sri Lankans on the Booker Prize that went to a Sri Lankan this last night. Let me start by just listing 4 facts that usually lead to the conclusions that people draw about Sri Lanka, China's role in Sri Lanka's debt crisis. The first is that Sri Lanka is in a debt crisis. The debt has been deemed unsustainable by the International Monetary Fund and others. And in April 2022, this year, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt. The second fact is that China is the largest official creditor to Sri Lanka. Now, I use those words deliberately because the total amount of China's debt to Sri Lanka is 10%. But it's 50% of the official bilateral debt. So you take all the government debt, the governments that have lent Sri Lanka money, half of that is Chinese debt. Then the third fact, which everybody seems to know about, is that China has a 99-year lease on Hambantota Port, which is a port in southern Sri Lanka. So that port is now a Chinese port effectively for 99 years. And the fourth fact is that Sri Lanka has a geostrategic location. It sits on the major trade routes of shipping between Europe and Africa, Europe and Asia, and it's 21 miles from India. Right? Now, I would say that many people put these 4 facts together, that Sri Lanka has a debt crisis, that China is the largest official creditor, that China has this 99-year lease on Hambantota Port, and Sri Lanka has this geostrategic location, and they conclude that Sri Lanka is in a Chinese debt trap. That's the phrase I hear most often. They draw a connection among these 4 facts that can lead to this conclusion that this is a classic Chinese debt trap that Sri Lanka is caught in. But I want to try to make the case that there's keeping the same facts as they are. I mean, the facts are the facts, they can't change. We can come up with a completely different interpretation of these same 4 facts. First, the lease of Hambantota Port was actually a purely economic transaction. It was a commercial deal rather than anything political or even geostrategic. And incidentally, it was leased for $1 billion, And Sri Lanka used that $1 billion not to pay back the Chinese, but to pay off the private creditors, right? And if you look back at the history of Hambantota Port, there was very little reason to think that it was anything but a commercial transaction. First, Sri Lanka wanted to build, the Sri Lankan government wanted to develop Hambantota Port because it was the president's birthplace and a lagging region in the country, a poor region in the country. And, you know, the feasibility studies were done first by the Canadian aid agency, CEDA, and then subsequently by a Danish firm to see whether they could build the port. Sri Lanka then approached the Americans and the Indians to finance Hambantota Port, and both refused. And it was then that they went to the Chinese, and the Chinese Exim Bank did agree to finance Hambantota Port and have China Harbor, the company, actually build it. But the trouble was that that port was not making any money. And the Sri Lankans made a big mistake, I'd say, which is usually you build a port in two phases. One is just so that it can take ships that are carrying cargo that don't require containers. So it's oil and grain and things like that. And then you make some money out of that, and then you use that to build the second phase, which is a container terminal. But instead, they started building the second phase before they actually made any money out of the first phase of the harbor, and as a result, the entire operation was losing money, and therefore the government was losing money. But at the same time, they had this mountain of private debt that was coming due. The commercial bondholders were asking for repayment. So that was when they made a commercial decision that they could lease Hambantota Port to China Harbor, the same company that built it, to run it, and they offered $1 billion, which was exactly what they needed to pay off the private creditors, and that was the deal. Let me add then that in terms of the other fact that people interpret it as, given Sri Lanka's geostrategic location, there would be a case that the Chinese still were interested in the port for reasons other than commercial returns. But Hambantota Port is particularly not suitable for naval operations because it's an inlet that is built in to avoid the tidal waves of the Indian Ocean. And so only one ship can go in and out at any time. So this would not be a good place to have a naval operation where you have also all the other naval ships sitting, waiting to get into this narrow corridor, which will be like shooting fish in a barrel if anybody wants to hit them. So there was hardly any strategic consideration by the Chinese or the Sri Lankans for that matter about the Hambantota Port. And then the other point I want to make is that the Sri Lanka's debt crisis, the first fact that I started with, is due to profligate policies by the Rajapaksa government. In 2019, the newly elected Rajapaksa government cut taxes to the point where Sri Lanka now has the lowest tax to GDP ratio in the world, and the fiscal deficit ballooned. And the credit rating agencies, the ones who look at the private credit, they downgraded Sri Lanka to near default levels in 2020. But what what the government did was continue to pay the creditors and instead of going to the IMF for a program and undertaking a debt restructuring, despite the fact that many people, myself included, were advising them to do so. And they refused to do this for 2 years. And if you start paying your debt service out of reserves, you suddenly run out of reserves, which is what happened in February 2022. And then that led to the default in April 2022. Now, the one thing I would say, though, is, and that's reflected in the fact that 50% of the bilateral debt is Chinese, is that the Sri Lankan government did have a preference for borrowing from the Chinese vis-a-vis the Western countries. But that again was not the Chinese pushing loans on Sri Lanka, but it was due to another political factor, which is at the end of the Civil War in 2009, there were a large number of human rights violations in the country. And the UN Human Rights Council actually passed a resolution saying that Sri Lanka should investigate these human rights violations, and they wanted external observers to come in and essentially undertake a whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the Sri Lankan government at the time, and every government since then, has refused any external scrutiny. And there's this constant tug of war. And they think of the UN Human Rights Council as being dominated by the Western powers, by the US, the UK, Europe, and a few others, who are the ones who vote in favor of these resolutions. So they associated borrowing from the IMF as part of, and they associate the IMF with the Western powers. So they associate borrowing from the IMF as if you're currying favor with these Western powers who want to investigate human rights violations. And just to give you some evidence of that, during this period, during the rebuilding period, they just in the last 3 years, they turned down a $500 million grant from the U.S., from the Millennium Challenge Corporation. That was a grant, not a loan. And they turned down $1 billion loan from the Japanese, and they associate the Japanese with the Western powers as well. That loan had an interest rate of 0.1%. Now think about that. If you could have had that loan today, you would be sitting very pretty. Instead, they turned to the Chinese. So they rejected financing from the Western country. They turned to the Chinese, even though they were at higher interest rates, but they thought the Chinese were more neutral on these human rights issues. And in many ways, I think the Chinese were also turned a blind eye to the policy failures, such as the cut in taxes that led to the debt crisis, and they would lend without scrutinizing the policy framework. And as a result of that, Sri Lanka did end up with a debt crisis with the Chinese, with 50% of the bilateral credit from China, but it was not due to the Chinese debt trap. It was due to the misguided policies of the Sri Lankan government itself.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very provocative take. So I don't think Ambassador Haqqani has been able to join us yet. Any update on that? I'm going to presume no. So I thought we would next go to Dr. Samaranayake. I hope I didn't butcher that. I'm unfortunately one of those people who knows Northern and South Asian names, but I completely choke on Sri Lankan and Southern India names. So I thought I would, did I butcher it completely?
No, it sounds fine.
All right. No, tell me how I should pronounce your last name.
Samaranayaka.
Samaranayaka. Okay, perfect. So that's it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. The E at the end threw me off. So yeah. I think if it's okay with you, I'd like to bring you in. And sure. I know that you also, because I know of your work and I've heard you present at other forums, that you also follow other countries in South Asia. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind contributing to this discussion and what your views are. And take it away if you've got 15 minutes.
Sure, great. I prepared about 5 minutes, but I'm happy to take additional questions about the region as well. But first of all, my thanks to you, Professor Fair, and Georgetown for the invitation to participate today. It's an honor. I'll speak about my personal research on Sri Lanka and the smaller countries of South Asia. And I'll start by making 3 points. So first of all, I think it's helpful to use a lens of viewing smaller countries on their own terms. I find this has often been lacking in the past. with attention placed on larger countries such as India or great powers like the United States and China. Although I think with the Sri Lanka crisis, if there is an upside to this crisis, it has enabled more voices to fill this gap and inform our understanding. And there's a lot to unpack at this level of analysis, like the leadership dynamics with the Rajapaksa family, as we heard the professor mention, also party political positions and historical economic approaches. But broadly speaking, smaller states like Sri Lanka, they have agency in the situation that they find themselves in. They're not just victims of China, going back to this debt trap concept in today's event title. And in Sri Lanka's case, it made some poor choices, particularly as a middle income country. For example, it did not sufficiently update its debt management practices for a long time, especially as it saw access to concessional lending dry up and debt repayments come more quickly. And it also pursued sovereign bonds excessively and ended up depleting its foreign currency reserves. So there is agency and accountability for small states, not just victimhood, as is often implied with this debt trap narrative. But at the same time, great powers like China, they also have responsibilities. So as we heard the professor mention, they have a responsibility to not extract an excessive 99-year lease to Sri Lanka's southern port in Hambantota, especially when the country was in a difficult balance of payments situation at the time. And I'll add to the professor's point about the US role. I researched the development of the port more than a decade ago, and I was able to interview the US ambassador to Sri Lanka at the time, who essentially talked about the situation Sri Lanka was facing as it was ending the war, and really seeing private investors who were not interested in the rebuilding of the country. And he talked about how President Rajapaksa at the time approached him for investment in this port project. So it wasn't necessarily the Chinese were seeking a way in. It was the Sri Lankans seeking to develop that region. There are many reasons why, but essentially, the U.S. ambassador was able to say yes, that Rajapaksa has also approached the Americans for investment in building that port, because that was certainly a local and national level project, given the importance of the port sector to the country and economic development. So he basically confirmed that it wasn't just the Indians that the Sri Lankans approached; they also approached the Americans for investment. And to American investors, Sri Lanka, it's in a civil war. It really wasn't an attractive investment option at the time. So I think that's important when we're thinking about the role of China, to what extent China has a role. But getting back to this point about how great powers have responsibilities, China also has a responsibility now to actively participate in Sri Lanka's efforts to restructure its bilateral debts. And it's not really credible for China to consider itself a leader for the developing world when it's not willing to aid a country and its citizens during such a severe time of crisis. And the situation, of course, has been exacerbated more structurally by the pandemic and global inflation. So it's a lot worse. And then third, on reflection, after having studied this topic, I think people get from the Sri Lanka case what they need from it. And I've come to see it as perhaps a geopolitical Rorschach test, where we've seen an American vice president comment on it, the CIA director comment on it. And for a small country, that's pretty striking attention. And I think it's where people have their pictures in place, and they're looking for additional data points to confirm their thesis. So I find Sri Lanka and some of the other smaller countries of South Asia, they often conveniently serve this role in a lot of the discourse as these data point countries. And I think it's important to ask ourselves as analysts, what are we getting out of deploying this particular data point? Who wins? Who benefits from this particular account? Are we examining counter data points? Are we considering different levels of analysis to explain a particular episode? So I think for the theme of this, our event today of demystifying the topic, I think this methodological point is one to consider. It's worth considering, just as we continue to expand our analysis of the topic. And I'll pause there.
Thank you both. So I actually have a question. Since Ambassador Haqqani doesn't appear to be coming, and Andrew Small wasn't able to make it as he's in Berlin, and the time difference was just a bit too much for him. So I have a question for both Professor Devarajan as well as Dr. Samaranayaka. Would you say, well, I guess I'm wondering if either of you know the particularities of the Pakistan case, and whether you would argue that Pakistan is also a case that does not exemplify Chinese debt trap diplomacy. I guess I'll start first with Professor Devarajan and then Dr. Samaranayaka.
I don't know the details of the China-Pakistan relationship, but I have been looking at Pakistan's debt situation, partly because of the comparison with Sri Lanka, and they've had me speak in Pakistan a few times as well. And what I would say there is that Pakistan is not in an unsustainable debt situation yet. So it's at a slightly different phase in this trajectory. We know that there's huge Chinese investments, the Gwalior port and the roadway and everything else. My other impression is these aren't unproductive investments. They're actually potentially productive investments, unlike Hambantota Port, which I think is a disaster. So in some sense, again, without knowing the details of the Chinese relationship, Pakistan is in a better, less worse debt situation, and slightly better in terms of the Chinese investments in the country.
On a similar note, I mean, have you been following the China-Myanmar relationship? Some years ago, I know the Indians were really quite excited, might be a good word, about the Chinese port at Chaopiu, and of course the Indians also invested in a pretty unproductive port at Sitwe. That's a port to nowhere right now. So I was wondering if you could speak also on the Myanmar relationship. With China.
I'm afraid I haven't followed that at all.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm not sure. So, Dr. Samaranayaka, are you still here?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Chinese debt structure with the Pakistan? Because Ambassador Haqqani isn't here yet. With either Pakistan or some of the other smaller countries, for example, Myanmar. I know some years ago when the Chinese opened up the port at Chaopiu, the Indians were exercised. They opened up a port at Sitwe, some pretty similar to Hambantota, or even less productive than the port at Hambantota.
Yes. In terms of the Pakistanis' relationship with China, I'm not familiar with the terms of the loans, but I think one important point when we're thinking about the Pakistan-China relationship and then China's relations with the smaller countries of South Asia, essentially not India, not Pakistan, I think one key difference is just considering the India-Pakistan long history of tensions and conflict and rivalry and nuclear armed powers, it's very different for the smaller countries, which they have to contend with India as the dominant country in the region. So I see that as really a structural obstacle for any of these smaller countries to try to somehow manipulate their relationships with China for some kind of advantage, because essentially they've seen themselves at the losing end of that game, if you will, historically. So I think to that extent, India, it's a factor that works in India's favor when we're thinking about the geopolitics of the region. So I think that's, even if there is similarity, between Pakistan and the smaller South Asian countries in terms of the loans or the patterns, I think strategically it's a very different situation.
So I want to thank Professor Khan. He very kindly stepped up from the role of participant as a listener to actually one as a contributor, as a panelist after Andrew Small had to withdraw. So poor Bangladesh, it seems to get left out of so many discussions. It's either clumped as a smaller country of South Asia, but actually Bangladesh is not a small country in South Asia. I often joke that Bangladesh is like the Rodney Dangerfield of South Asia, and that it gets no respect. But Bangladesh is actually a very intriguing country for so many reasons, despite the corruption. There's human development progress in Bangladesh. In many ways, correct me if I'm wrong, it has exceeded that of Pakistan and many Indian states. And I know that Sheikh Hasina has also been very wary of, well, she sounds like she's in a similar situation, right? She's looking for funds to develop her country. She's wary of China. It seems like sometimes she plays China as a foil to see if she can get the Americans to care. And so far, the Americans don't really seem to care in developing Bangladesh infrastructure. So I was wondering if you could walk us through what Bangladesh is doing, the choices that it's been forced to make, or just in general, how is it managing this conundrum?
Thank you, Dr. Fair. Thank you, Georgetown, for giving me a space to speak. At least thank you, Dr. Fair, for recognizing that it is no longer a small state, even if you take the economic depth or population, or perhaps if you add its diaspora, is probably almost like the American population. Now, going back to your question, where do we stand at the moment? I mean, the first thing is, if you look at Bangladesh's debt portfolio, we are very much plagued with the idea of the Chinese debt coming into Bangladesh, which is less than 7%. But very interesting part, what we are not talking about is how much the Russian debt in Bangladesh is, which is quite astronomical, 6% above. Now, that's exactly the point where our debt portfolio becomes quite interesting. Now, apart from that, the whole idea of where do we get our debt from? I mean, it's mostly multilateral, but the worrying factor is somewhere else, is the power sector. And that's exactly where we are now struggling quite substantially, because we will have to start repaying our power sector debt, which constitutes almost 5% of our GDP. And that's exactly where we will have the problem. The second problem that we are now envisaging is coming from the private sector debt too. So while public sector debt is an important factor, but the private sector debt is increasing at an astronomical level. So this is where the economy lies when it comes to demystifying the Chinese role. And the Chinese investment can be seen through two prisms. The first prism, as you have mentioned rightly, that there is a need for infrastructure development and to infuse money to sustain an economy of 170 million people. But on the other hand, it is not only because of the Chinese that the economy continues to run. It is also our export and import balancing. We get our raw material from Beijing, which is essentially the prime exporter to Bangladesh, like it is in India. Astronomically, India has almost like $70 billion trade deficit with China. And then our biggest buyers are all coming from the West. Now, that makes us pretty much worried about the relationship between Beijing and Washington alliance, rather than looking into the other countries as such. Now, that's where the foreign policy's main concerns really pops up. I mean, not along with the debt structure that we are seeing, this whole idea of how do we sustain our export market, particularly RMG remittance and so on. So this is where the foreign policy of the country comes in, as well as the economic policies are geared towards. The second important factor why why we continue to develop. The first one is it has no conflict economy at the moment. I mean, if you look at Bangladesh's neighborhood, each and every country has some sort of conflict elements. I mean, if you look at Pakistan-India dynamics, India-China dynamics, or even the recent relationship between Nepal and India, and perhaps the relationship between, as you have rightly mentioned in earlier when you asked the question to Nilanthi and Professor, that where the hell Myanmar stands in this whole equation. That's the new geopolitical flashpoint. I mean, it is a geostrategic blind point for Yunnan and the southern and northern part of China, as well as this is a main concern for Northeast India. Now, therefore, both the countries are essentially prisoner of geography at the moment. That's exactly where, if you see that Bangladesh tried to balance between India and China, which really didn't work out when the relationship between Myanmar and Bangladesh came. So therefore, the question remains for the foreign policy as well as the economics, that where do we go from here to solve the Myanmar crisis? And that's, again, the new questions are coming up with what would be the role of Washington. And that's exactly where the continuity prism comes in, whether the United States will remain as a state that will continue a policy of Indo-Pacific strategy that will have the stable continuity. But as you see, the rise of the crisis of secularism across the region, that also has a competing pressure on all the governments, whether it is the Burmese government or Bangladesh government or Indian government, or perhaps even now in Pakistan government. And the whole ecosystem of economics, of political economy of these countries' relationship or security, hence therefore becomes a competing issue where religion plays, public consumption pattern plays a different role, political institutions plays a different role. And the political institutions from the Sri Lankan crisis, I won't say that any other countries are having better political institutions, but certainly the political institutions, apart from political institutions, economic institutions are fairly playing better role. But the problem lies, again, if you look at the overall external debt portfolio of South Asia, I mean, this is increasingly becoming worrying, because at the moment, more than 70% of total external debt comes to India, and then subsequently to 24% and 12% to Bangladesh. And that makes the country even more worryingly susceptible to new kind of shocks that we are anticipating coming in future. So as I mentioned, the too many variables at the moment, at the end of the day, how we succeeded among all these variables is essentially the private sector. And the private sector played an increasingly strong role in making the balancing between Washington and Beijing. And why so? Because we have a very strong ready-made garments industry. We have a very strong textile industry. We have very strong other industries, which essentially tries to make sure that the lobbies, both in Beijing and Washington, work well. Now, with all these factors, what comes as another shock for us is the role of the international community when it comes to the Bay of Bengal. And this is where we are now seeing another blurring space between geopolitics and geoeconomics. For us, it is essentially economics that has to sustain. On the other hand, when we link it with the Indo-Pacific strategy, or perhaps any other strategy, then we find that there is a problem of continuity and discontinuity. At least Beijing did not pursue a policy of discontinuity, whether it is Bangladesh or perhaps Sri Lanka. I agree with Nilanthi said that why Chinese didn't step up when Sri Lanka was going down the drain. The very simple reason is that it was a pure economic cost calculation, because the Chinese strategy, whether they engage with Bangladesh or Pakistan, eventually has a very trade mercantile approach to that. And that's exactly where they decided not to step in. And if you look at Myanmar question, I'm going back to Myanmar time to time. Myanmar has two types of debt history with China. If you look at Aung San, when Aung San was there, the Chinese debt started to decline substantially, and even it declined to a point where 26% decline was achieved under Aung San. And then post Aung San, General Leng came in power, and then obviously he has three new friends to sustain its economy. The first friend is, of course, continuity, that is China. The new friend is Russia, and obviously the other friend, which has been trying to dwindle around, is the Chinese, as Dr. Fair has rightly mentioned. I mean, investing in Sitwe was probably one of the economic fiasco that India has ever embraced in external in foreign land. I think this is where Bangladesh was extremely cautious, and Bangladesh's first historical lesson came from 2017, when it realized that geopolitical compulsion won't allow it to really find a meaningful quote-unquote friend when it comes to international trade or international security, linking whether it is Beijing or Moscow or Nopido or perhaps Washington. The second lesson, which I believe has been taken into consideration substantially, is the infrastructure cannot be unsustainable. Now, if you look at the Padma Bridge, which is essentially a flagship bridge for the government, was initially offered to be financed by the World Bank, and which World Bank declined. And then even in many of the infrastructure projects, Bangladesh reached out to India and many other countries, which didn't materialize. And therefore, the Chinese stepped in. So overall, the second lesson for Bangladesh has always been is to really keep the debt portfolio or perhaps the governance structure quite right. I agree that there is a malfunction within the governance, largely due to political institutions. But perhaps if you look at the 170 million people who essentially work 24/7, creates an economic capital which continues the fueling the government to continue. And the last lesson that we essentially received from international community as well as within the domestic political constituency is the ecosystem. I mean, the financial ecosystem. Just yesterday, there was a debate going on that how do we pay the Russians for financing the nuclear power plant, which is roughly around $13 billion project. And one of the mechanisms that has been discussed is through China, because Moscow wants it in ruble. If we send it, we don't have the capacity to send it through ruble. So essentially, yuan becomes another way of debt financing over here. And that's exactly the problem, is who is going to take the additional burden, who's going to pay for the additional burden of currency swap, because we have been doing our agreement with the Russians where under the London system, and now we are going for the other secured system, and that's where another crisis is looming for us. That how are we going to solve that currency swap problem? And when the currency swap problem comes, and then again the role of the multilaterals as well as the Western states essentially pops up. Now, are we going to interpret it through the geopolitical prism, or are we going to interpret it through the pure economic prism? And that's the choice that both the country as well as the international community will have to make in the coming years. That's my 2 cents on how we are trying to survive.
Great. Well, thank you for those formal presentations. I've learned a lot from this discussion. I think I had sort of believed the hype about the Chinese debt trap at Hambantota. So this was a really timely corrective. It really is unfortunate that Ambassador Hussein Haqqani wasn't able to make it, because the reading that I've done on the Chinese relationship with Pakistan seems to be really quite different, because most people, when they think about the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor, they mostly think about infrastructure. But actually, that's not the largest component of CPEC. The largest component of CPEC is actually agricultural. And it looks as if the big shiny move is look over here at these infrastructure developments, while we, while no one's actually paying attention, are making a lot of risky propositions, basically using Pakistani land for these agricultural ventures, some of which largely seem to serve Chinese interests. And of course, Pakistan is being paid for this. But when you think about how water scarce Pakistan is, this is not for nothing. So I think what we'll do, go ahead, and I think this is pretty manageable. If anyone has a question for any of the panelists, let me ask you guys, is the hand function enabled, or are we just using the chat function? Nakash? All right, I'm going to assume that since no one's there, that we'll just
the hand function as well as the comment section should all be active.
There's already a question, Christine.
Yeah. Oh no. I have it. So Ravi Uttap, who is your question for? If you could say who your question is addressed to, that would be really helpful. Or is your question posed to all of the panelists?
Interesting question.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go in the order in which you guys presented. First, Professor Devarajan, then Dr. Samarayanaka, and then Professor Khan.
Thank you for this question, Ravi. Or at least it's something that I spent some time thinking about too. What I find is that, there's no question the U.S. is engaged in a geopolitical battle with China. The trouble is, if you want to help South Asian development, you really should stop fighting those battles in South Asia.
Right.
This is what we're experiencing with the debt restructuring. Christine, you mentioned earlier about China's role in the debt restructuring. Well, yes, it's important for China to get China on board and to collaborate with the other creditors on debt restructuring for Sri Lanka. But statements by Samantha Powers and Tony Blinken and others in the U.S. about the China debt, how Sri Lanka is a victim of the China debt trap, are distinctly unhelpful to bringing China on board. And frankly, it's the same thing on the other side. The Chinese make statements about how they don't want to engage in a debt restructuring that helps to bail out American banks. Now, neither of these is true. As I was saying, Sri Lanka is not the victim of a Chinese debt trap, and debt restructuring is not going to bail out American banks. And yet, the rhetoric on both sides gets in the way of true cooperation. So just, fight your geopolitical battle somewhere else, and let South Asia develop.
Yeah, Dr. Samarayanaka.
Yes, to build on the professor's points, I think we've seen U.S. officials really jump to framing the situation through this lens of strategic competition or great power competition. And I think by doing that in U.S. messaging, it risks misrepresenting the situation and not taking into account actual economic statistics and overlooking domestic factors as drivers, such as we talked about what some of the factors were in developing the southern port in Sri Lanka, some of the local factors. It had been a restive region for many years. It had been affected by the tsunami. Really, the understanding that full picture of drivers is important. But I think this approach to adopting a lens of strategic competition, it can put the smaller states in South Asia in a difficult position that they don't necessarily have to be in as they navigate the relations with some of the major powers. And ultimately, I think it can send a message that diminishes the agency of smaller states and can actually minimize the extent to which they accept responsibility for the state they're in by repeating this message that they're victims, because they do have agency. Certainly great power dynamics, those are going to continue, but there also needs to be that reckoning in terms of where some of the smaller states in South Asia do have agency. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think this end state for Sri Lanka, it was a long time coming, and it has causes that entail China, but also go beyond the reach of China. So understanding the structural situation that some of these middle income countries find themselves in, but then understanding their bilateral lending relationships with China and also Japan. It's important to mention Japan's role here. And then this trend of international sovereign bonds, and what that's getting at in terms of it's a symptom of a deeper debt problem. I think that is worthy of greater U.S. attention and influence in essentially influencing these outcomes that we're seeing in South Asia, which I think has been lacking. It's interesting if you look at the recently released national security strategy. There is this line in there about how the U.S. should avoid the temptation to see the world solely through the prism of strategic competition, and will continue to engage countries on their own terms. And I found that to be a really interesting addition, because I imagine they're hearing from some of these countries in the region, like, hey, the U.S. and China have those dynamics going on, but we face a lot of development objectives that we're trying to meet, and especially in the context of global inflation and trying to recover from the pandemic. So I thought that was an interesting addition to the national security strategy.
Professor Khan, anything that you'd like to say in response to Ravi's question?
Let me start with one interesting point that we often miss out. I mean, this is one of the major development debate in Bangladesh right now, which is technology. I mean, let's take the Huawei for next 2 minutes. Now, the 5G, Bangladesh needs to graduate from its 2.5 or whatever 3G to 5G. For which it has started talking to different partners for that technology to come. Now, are we going to buy the Chinese one? Are we going to buy the European one? I mean, here comes the human rights issues very acutely. First of all, we need to ensure that the end user gets the cheapest possible access to internet so that they can change their life, and then we can significantly reduce the digital divide so that we can compete with education and innovation too. Now, that's the question. Are we going to have it from the Chinese or the others? This is where I think one major answer that should come from the Western countries, particularly the US, how Bangladesh is going to transit or transform its the new economy through technology transfer. So this is number one. This is how we need to have a solution from the Western partners who have been generalizing Bangladesh or perhaps South Asia. The second important factor is the trust deficit. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, always remember the continuity factor. And it's when Stephen Wiegand visited Dhaka a couple of years back, they said that Bangladesh will be the centerpiece of Indo-Pacific strategy. But if Indo-Pacific strategy comes up in the post-Ukraine war by saying regarding China either or, probably all these countries will have an extremely conservative views on that. And that essentially will not substantially improve the bilateral relationship or multilateral approach towards the Indo-Pacific or perhaps Washington-based alliances. And that's where I think the greater conversation and discussion should take place. And the last point that I believe is very important for the Western countries to find solutions to the massively changing demography. And the demography that you see in India, see in Pakistan, see in Bangladesh, or even to a country which has essentially put itself into the worst possible scenario. And perhaps the disintegration of that country will not be something surprising in the future in Myanmar. Is perhaps we need to find out a development solution for the new demography. And that's exactly where I think the United States and the alliances should come up with some sort of effective, meaningful solutions where the choices will not be either or perhaps for everyone, and where you can think of your economy inclusively, whether it is China to be a part of it, or Myanmar to be a part of it, or perhaps every other countries having conflict or having tensions should have a solution to that. And I think that solution, addressing that solution, should be the course of debate rather than just looking into the facts and figures or numbers at the moment. And I believe this is where the main thrust of the Indo-Pacific, or perhaps the bilaterals, should be in future.
Thank you guys very much. So Allison O'Neill has an interesting question. I'm not sure if this is appropriate for this panel in entirety. She wants to know about the military value of some of the other ports. So I can take Sitwe. I actually did visit Sitwe on a number of occasions. So it depends on how you define military, actually. So if you take a look at a map of India, the only way that India can resupply its ground forces in the Northeast is through what's called the Siliguri corridor, or the chicken neck. And it is incredibly vulnerable to being cut off by the Chinese. So the Indians have been very anxious to find an alternative way of resupplying its troops in the Northeast. And so again, if you look at a map, there are two possible ways. So, or some combination thereof. But Sitwe, it was intended to be an alternative ground line of communication to resupply its troops. So what would happen is that material would be loaded onto ships at, say, Mumbai, Visakhapatnam, what have you. They would then go to Sitwe. But if you look at the map, Sitwe then has, and so the port was fully dredged. It's a deep sea port. But no, nothing's showing up there for a bunch of reasons beyond the scope of this discussion. But then what next had to happen for that to be an effective ground line of communication is that the river had to be dredged and the system of barges had to be installed. That's not happening. Certainly didn't happen under Aung San Suu Kyi, because in addition to the Rohingya situation, you actually had a Buddhist Rakhine insurgency, because they also were going after Muslims because of Buddhist nationalism. So in Myanmar, you have the dispute between the state and Rakhine really targeting Muslims, and then within Rakhine, it's because Rakhine itself is sort of what's the word I'm looking for? A neglected province, and Burmans, so I'm using Burmese with deliberate choice here, they look down upon those from Rakhine generally. And then within Rakhine state, you have this conflict between Buddhists and Muslims. So for a bunch of reasons, that dredging of that river never happened. And then you also had to have this terminal at the Myanmar-India border, and that involved a bunch of infrastructure that had to be built. And due to unrest in the sort of receiving end of the Indian states that were concerned, labor unrest as well as insurgency, nothing has happened. So you've got this beautiful port, and it literally has no place to go. I don't know if anyone else, I tried to go to Chao Pyu. I wasn't able to get to Chao Pyu. It's very difficult. It's actually on an island. So I don't know if anyone else can, and of course, Gwadar has enormous military potential. That's very likely, I would say, the most consequential of these ports for military purposes. Does anyone know about Chao Pyu, what its military competencies or capabilities are?
Can I answer, Dr. Fair, if you will?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I've been closely working on Bangladesh-Myanmar issue, particularly the Rakhine issue, very closely with a number of actors, including the United Nations. Now, you have rightly pointed out, I mean, this is quite a paradox to see that Buddhist nationalists fighting against the Buddhist nationalists, and that to the Buddhist nationalist military. And this is where I think the whole problem lies in Myanmar. But when you talk about Chiapu, the military establishment and perhaps the idea of using it as a geopolitical or geostrategic gateway is still evolving. And when I visited there, and perhaps obviously didn't get enough access, but for sure, what we have seen is the way Tatmadaw is dealing with this particular supply line is increasingly becoming volatile. So this is one way of seeing that. The second important factor when it comes to Myanmar, as well as this is a lesson for Bangladesh. Again, I'm repeatedly mentioning the term lesson for Bangladesh, is as long as the Chinese and Indians will not stop seeing Bangladesh or Myanmar as an alternative defense supply line for them, the relationship will never improve, or it will never be sustainable. Now, look at this. I mean, whether Chiakpo, you say, or perhaps Sitwe, or the entire connectivity that either Delhi or Beijing interprets through the prism of defense supply line. Even the connectivity that is being discussed in Dhaka, in the northern side of Bangladesh, Beijing interprets it as an alternative defense supply line for the Indians when it comes to the chicken neck. And Dr. Fair, you know that the chicken neck is the most delicate space between Nepal and Bangladesh that allows India to have access to Northeast India. And perhaps that's exactly the narrative of defense supply line has to be debated once again. And that is much more critical than the what we call debt trap diplomacy and other diplomacies. So by saying that, the volatility, as you have rightly mentioned, the Burman identity, and the Burman identity has become another problem for the Kachins and Shans and everyone. And that's the reason you're now seeing that the Tatmadaw is losing its grip, not only on Chiakpo, but also in the Wa state. And look at the Wa state has its own army, which has held its parade last month.
Yeah, because of Chinese
exactly.
military
Yes, I was coming to that.
of helicopters and artillery.
And that means the love affair with Beijing has strange elements where the Chinese are backing up the Wa State Army too. So this is why I think Myanmar will be the next flashpoint for both ASEAN and South Asia, as well as the Americans, as well as the Western countries.
Dr. Samarnaika, I know you work at CNA, you work on naval issues. I was wondering if you had anything you want to add on the military value of these ports or lack thereof.
I really researched this as part of my personal research. So what I can offer is, essentially Sri Lanka. I did a study for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I was able to visit Hambantota Port actually a few times. And when you go there, it's really a remote port. It's in the southern-eastern part of the country. It's very different, very far away from the western province where Colombo is, and the major port of the country is in Colombo. It's the idea behind the development of Hambantota Port is really about using it as a place to catch passing ships and bunkering fuel and providing them with fuel as they're coming by. Because it makes sense when you look at the location of Hambantota on a map, and you think of all of the ships that pass on the main east-west sea lanes. It made a lot of sense, and that at least was the thinking about it. So it's not really designed to compete with Colombo, the busiest transshipment port in South Asia. It's meant really for that purpose of providing bunkering fuel. They've tried to build up ships that are transiting in terms of vehicles, automobiles, and the roll-on, roll-off ships. So it's not designed for military purposes. And again, there are factors behind the development of the country, essentially trying to spread some of the wealth from the Western province, connecting an underdeveloped part of the country in the southeast. Also, as was mentioned, the Rajapaksas are from that part of the country, so there's also that historical tie. And then the region was also affected by the tsunami. So even the previous leader before Rajapaksa, under her leadership, there was this effort or momentum to actually address some of the issues. So in terms of military, the Sri Lankan Navy, the Southern Command is moving to Hambantota, and they've set up a Navy camp there. So there's certainly efforts to defend it. They have rapid deployment teams to defend the port. And it's certainly under the control of the Sri Lanka Ports Authority. The Chinese company has operational control, but it's very much a Sri Lankan port as opposed to a Chinese port. And at the end of the day, when you think about the Indian military, how quickly the Indian military can deploy to the south of the country, on top of the Indians' extensive maritime domain awareness network, Sri Lanka and India have a very close defense relationship. So it's just that idea of China somehow manipulating that. India would definitely have a say if there's any suggestion of a strategic use of that port by China.
So we have another set of questions that, and actually it's a question that I have. So, and I think some of this goes back to, I believe it was Booz Allen Hamilton in 2004 who first put forward the notion of string of pearls. And a lot of people have pushed back on that. So I really liked, Professor Devarajan, how you kind of put together these different facts and then how people have strung together a story from those facts. And there are alternative stories that could be strung. And I'm going to, again, rely upon all of your expertise, but I also suspect that Dr. Samarnayaka has some particular insights given the nature of her personal research in maritime issues. So if you do speak to Indian strategists, for example, and they're the folks with whom I mostly interact on these issues, they will point out to, the Indians seem very much to believe in this notion of string of pearls, whether you're looking at Djibouti, whether you're looking at Chinese efforts to hedge the Indians out of the new port in Iran. The Indians certainly are worried, or at least they say they're worried about China. So is this debt trap diplomacy a real thing anywhere? And perhaps Professor Devarajan can speak to this. Or is it a much more disputable concept akin to the whole string of pearls policy? Is there any there?
I would say that there is some there. But maybe it's the word diplomacy that's that I object to.
Okay.
Because
mercantilism.
There's a large number of countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, that have taken on large amounts of Chinese debt, and are now in a situation where they can't pay it back. That's a fact that we have to accept. Whether that's the result of debt trap diplomacy or not is the question that certainly in my mind, because I think what did go on, and a little bit, this happened a little bit in Sri Lanka as well, but mostly in the African countries, is that China was willing to lend to these countries at commercial rates, but into a policy framework that was so distorted that the multilaterals who care about policy frameworks were not willing to lend, or had limited lending, even though it was concessional. So basically, these countries had a choice. You either take the multilateral debt and try to fix your policy so that you can actually grow faster, or you don't bother with that. You take the Chinese debt and build your roads and power plants and so on, And I think the big mistake, and this, I think it's the countries themselves that made the mistake, is to think that just because you build a road, you actually get an increase in productivity.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's just not true. So you have, I mean, Ethiopia has tons of roads. I've driven on some of them. There is no car to be seen other than the one you're in. Zambia has a power plant, has a whole electric system, but and the Chinese built a bunch of power plants that are all running at a loss, and so you're unable to actually pay back the debt. So there is a debt trap, if you like, but I wouldn't call it diplomacy, and I don't think in the African case there's some geostrategic or military motivation for that. I think it just really is just bad economics.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Dr. Fair. I'm just adding to Professor Devarajan. I think the whole idea of diplomacy and is essentially probably country specific, but obviously it's again, when you look at the African cases, it's more about authoritarian governments taking loans the way they want to, and that's absolutely bad economics. And perhaps the new idea of kleptocracy, if you see it through the prism of kleptocracy, that's exactly where the Chinese funding goes. But when it comes to the countries like Bangladesh or India or Pakistan or any other, and in that case, or even Central Asia, there is always return. And there is some sort of checks and balances are always there. I'm not, as you have rightly mentioned, the cases of Sri Lanka. It's a highly generalized interpretation of Sri Lanka all the time. But on the other hand, if you look at these countries, I mean, South Asia itself has such a market depth, which is absolutely, which has an absolute mercantile interest of Beijing. And I think this is where they're not going to risk their what you call money for unnecessary reasons. And with the whole influx of loans and debt, they know that this particular complex political economy can be dealt with in the long term. Even we signed a BRI for almost $40 billion. Not even 10% has been materialized. So which also says that it's more of a political governance in Africa. And that's why I would say that the whole term of debt diplomacy is perhaps a construction or constructed for certain purpose in certain countries or the region that.
Well, I think on this issue of Chinese debt diplomacy, we need to ask who exactly is the actor here. So if we're talking about China, then we need to ask some Chinese experts or experts on China who can read Chinese and ask what exactly is China's objective. Is it the debt trap diplomacy? Is that Beijing's intent? But as we're all talking about South Asia and what it actually looks like on the ground, I think that these are all developing countries, middle income countries. There are different aspects within that grouping. We actually saw Sri Lanka jump briefly to upper middle income, if you can imagine that. They're facing different levels of debt distress. Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, on the other hand, is a much bigger, much more resilient economy. It was interesting, Bangladesh actually turning to the IMF, because you can see what a priority graduating from that LDC status has been for the country, for its prime minister, and it's not willing to risk any setbacks to that goal. But Professor Fair, I thought you raised a really interesting point about that Booz Allen report from 2004, and it was discussed publicly in 2005 in media. At the time, it didn't even mention Hambantota, in Sri Lanka. It was focused really on Southeast Asia and South Asia, of course, looking at Pakistan. And there's certainly valid concerns on India's part, especially as it's fought a border war with China for the last 2 years. Of course, from its threat perceptions, it should be concerned about what China is intending to do, whether it's the so-called encirclement policy. So I think we need to, certainly look at the subject from the China actor perspective, but looking at the ground in South Asia, the string of pearls narrative, there was this expectation that China would somehow set up a base in one of the South Asian countries. Chittagong was discussed in that report. Sri Lanka, but where was China's first ever overseas base established? It wasn't even in South Asia. It was Djibouti. It was in Africa. It was in the Western Indian Ocean. So I think this speaks to really, we need to think a little bit bigger in terms of what our mental maps are. And perhaps it speaks to China's larger vision of what its ambitions are. But I think sometimes we get sort of trapped in whether it's a Southeast Asia focus or a South Asia focus, but to actually to test that hypothesis from 2004 and to see where that first ever Chinese military base overseas came up, it was not in Asia. So I think that's an important lesson for us as analysts.
So I'm really glad you raised this, because one of the things, you've been studying South Asia for a long time from a political military point of view. That's where I've lived all of my adult life, whether I like it or not. India is an aspiring blue water navy. I remember when I was a young analyst and I had an older Indian gentleman in uniform explain to me, and it was very eye-opening. That from India's point of view, it views its strategic neighborhood going all the way to the east coast of Africa, obviously including Djibouti, and then in the east, all the way to the Strait of Malacca, to the south to Antarctica, and the north basically abutting to Russia. And one of the things that I found at the time I was at the Bland Corporation, when you look at the different lenses that the US government has to understand South Asia, the combatant commands, they split it very conveniently, basically at India and Pakistan between Indo-Pacific Command and CENTCOM. The State Department keeps finagling its geographic lens, and the CIA has its own geographic lens. And so this sort of results in this kaleidoscope-like approach of analysts looking at the region from their own soda straw, which unfortunately in the US government, it literally is a soda straw. And whether they have a fat one or a thin one, it's still a soda straw. And they're terrible at integrating information from other soda straws. So from the Indian point of view, just because the first port was Djibouti, probably doesn't make it any less disconcerting, especially since the security of the sea lanes of communication are so vital to India. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think Professor Fair, that's a really important point. I have two thoughts on that. I think at least from India's perspective, the so-called neighborhood, the neighborhood countries, I think there is a primacy of that region of South Asia compared to Djibouti. So I think that's really point number one. I think the India's neighborhood policy, the neighborhood first, that's there for a reason. But yes, to your point, certainly India's view of its primary area of maritime interest, that has expanded. And it actually wasn't until 2015, with the release of its maritime security strategy, where India's primary area of maritime interest expanded fully westward to encompass the entire Western Indian Ocean as well. So I think it's interesting that even India, situated right there at the center of the Indian Ocean, India is even evolving in terms of its thinking of its maritime priorities and its geographic priorities. So it's been fascinating watching the US do this over the past decade, and the changing terms from the Asia Pacific, then the Indo-Asia Pacific was put forth as a concept, and now to the Indo-Pacific. But India itself is also coming to understand the importance of the maritime domain. And you've heard Indian naval officers over the years talk about Delhi's sea blindness, really prioritizing the land domain and a certain land centrism to strategy. But we have seen it in recent years, essentially an elevation of the maritime domain for Indian policymakers, and really seeing that in terms of official documents like the Indian Maritime Security Strategy. So yes, the fact that China does have its first ever overseas military base somewhere in the Indian Ocean, that is still concerning when India thinks about its now primary area of maritime interests since 2015.
So I remember someone saying to me many, many years ago, again, when I was at the Bland Corporation, it's called the Indian Ocean, which it seems so obvious until someone says it. And I reflected back to the Persian Gulf versus Gulf of Arabia discussion. I wanted to, there was something else that came to mind. Well, it's neither here nor there. It'll come back to me. Do either Professor Devarajan or any other comments on this before we move to what I think is the last question, which has really moved far astray from what we began talking about?
I just have one point here when it comes to Indian maritime strategy and India's view on the maritime domain is perhaps absolutely correct, but the problem remains is India itself is the largest victim of rivalries across its neighborhood. I mean, when you look into India's neighborhood first policy, and sometimes I even struggle that whether they're thinking United States as the neighbor or Bangladesh or Pakistan as the neighbor. Because essentially, if you look at the relationship it's with its immediate neighbors, is perhaps not at an optimal state. I mean, Bangladesh is being the largest trading partner for India in South Asia. And still, if you look at the non-tariff barriers between these two countries, is astronomically high. I mean, and even if you look at the trade relationship, we are talking about comprehensive economic partnership agreement. But what are we going to trade if we still have the colonial mindset and the bureaucracy, which is largely incapable to understand the changes and the continuity and discontinuity in economics and perhaps national security agenda? Sea lanes will always be a problematic, and that's going to be a bone of contention in the coming years. Look at India has just supplied a Kilo-class submarine, which is a Russian-built submarine, to Myanmar, and expecting to have a fascinating, stable Indo-Pacific is probably is a far away idea, probably that can only be successful if Delhi understands that the Russian Kilo-class submarine passing through Bangladesh, which is considered as the eternal friend, is not essentially a very friendly gesture. So that's one problem. The second problem is when the whole world is struggling with Myanmar, what to do with Myanmar genocide. And we still have a fascinating relationship with India in terms of military cooperation. But that has a limit when essentially we get to see that General Leng is being helped by three major countries, China, India, and Russia. And that perhaps also gives us an understanding that even if you have a solid national security strategy or perhaps a maritime strategy, implementing those will require strong and perhaps a very sane political understanding and political leadership. And that's why essentially I mentioned one term carefully. The crisis of secularism is going to be one of the predominant factors in understanding the national security implementation of national security strategy. We bought two submarines from China, and these are all Ming-class submarines. And now that we also again believe probably that was a great idea, at least we understood that how to really talk about the strategic autonomy over the water. And absolutely, Nilanthi was right that the sea lanes, not only for the Indians, but also for Bangladesh. And we had to go to international tribunal to delineate our maritime border, both with Myanmar and India, which didn't happen on a bilateral basis. But we solved many other problems on a bilateral basis, including with China. So I think the national security complex is going to be much more difficult in the coming years, unless Delhi understands the ecosystems are changing fast.
So I think we have addressed the questions that are in the chat. So maybe I should just take this as an opportunity to thank all of our panelists. I really learned a lot. I'm really thankful to Professor Devarajan, Professor Khan, and Dr. Samarayanaka to share their afternoon with us. This was. By the way, Dr. Samarayanaka, I am such a fan of your work. You probably never know that because I've been, it's not stuff I publish on, but I just wanted to give that shout out to you. I was really thrilled when you agreed to be a panelist. So just so you know, it would have been really nice if we had someone who was a specialist on China. That was going to be Andrew Small. Andrew Small, I think he might be one of the best positioned folks, both because he has the language skills that you discussed. He spent a lot of time in China, but he's also spent a lot of time in the South Asian countries as well. But being in Berlin, the time difference was something in the end he wasn't able to swing. But I want to thank all of the panelists. And I really want to thank all of the folks that participated in this first conference of its type. We are working on at least 2 other topics. We've discussed water scarcity in South Asia. We think that's an important topic. And we've also discussed, and I think Dr. Khan presciently noted this, the decline of secularism in South Asia. And in some cases, there was no secularism in the first instance, much less to consider its decline. It's only gotten worse. So stay tuned as we continue to work through these logistical cogs. But thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
This is a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.